Can I sit here with you for a while? Daniel Whitaker turned his head slightly. A little girl stood a few feet away on the sand, holding a red plastic bucket filled with seashells. Then he gave a slow, tired shake of his head. I'm sorry, sweetheart, he said gently. I think I'd like to be by myself for a little while. I just need some quiet time. But thank you for asking. The girl nodded politely. Okay. Daniel expected her to walk away, but instead, she stepped a little closer and carefully sat down in the sand beside him, leaving a respectful space between them. She placed the bucket down and looked out toward the ocean just as he had been doing. Daniel glanced sideways at her. You heard what I said, right? He asked softly. I did, she replied. The girl swung her feet lightly in the sand. My mom says when someone feels really sad, she said thoughtfully, it helps if they're not alone. Daniel exhaled quietly. He didn't respond. Sometimes, she continued, having one friend sit with you and talk makes the empty feeling smaller. Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly. I appreciate that, he said. But I'm not very good company today. That's okay. She turned her head and looked at him with calm seriousness. You still look like someone who shouldn't sit alone. Daniel didn't answer. The girl reached into her bucket and gently poured its contents onto the sand. A small pile of seashells scattered between them. She began arranging them carefully. My mom also says, the girl added, that when people feel lonely, having someone sit with them makes them feel less empty inside. Daniel watched her for a moment. What are you making? He asked. A house. She pressed a white shell into the sand. For the ocean. Daniel raised an eyebrow. For the ocean? She nodded as if it made perfect sense. Sometimes the ocean gets lonely too. Daniel stared at the tiny shape forming in the sand. Something about the sentence tugged unexpectedly at his chest. The girl leaned forward and traced a small path in the sand with her finger. Then she looked up at him again. Can I ask you something? Daniel hesitated. What? Why are you sad? Daniel blinked. He looked back at the horizon before answering. That's a long story. You can tell me, she said. Daniel gave a small shake of his head. You're a little young to understand all of that. The girl thought about it for a moment. Then she nodded. That's true. Daniel almost smiled. But I can still listen, she added. He looked at her again. She spoke gently, like someone repeating advice she had heard many times. My mom says when people talk about the sad things in their hearts, the sadness gets lighter. Lighter? Daniel asked. Like when you take heavy stuff out of your backpack. Daniel looked down at the sand. For a moment, he said nothing. Then another thought crossed his mind. He turned toward her again. Can I ask you something? He said. She nodded immediately. Sure. Why do you want to comfort a stranger? Daniel asked quietly. You don't even know who I am. The girl looked at him for a moment, considering the question carefully. Then she shrugged in the simple, honest way only children could. I know you're sad, she said. Daniel blinked. That's enough? She nodded. My mom says when someone is hurting, it doesn't matter if they're a stranger. Daniel studied her face. She continued placing shells into the sand. And anyway, she added thoughtfully, sometimes strangers need kindness the most. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Annie leaned back and looked at the tiny shell house she had made. Now it has a door, she said proudly. Daniel looked down at it. A memory surfaced suddenly. A beach decades ago. A pink plastic shovel. His younger sister Emily kneeling beside him, explaining why their sandcastle needed a door so people could come back home. The memory struck so sharply that Daniel had to look away. His eyes stung. He covered them briefly with one hand. The tears came quietly. Annie moved a little closer and placed another seashell on the sand. My mom says grown-ups cry when their hearts get too heavy, she said gently. Daniel looked at the small shell-shaped house. Then he bent down and picked up a flat seashell lying near his shoe. He pressed it carefully into the sand beside the others. Annie's face brightened immediately. See? She said happily. Now it's stronger. Daniel let out a slow breath. For the first time since the message had appeared on his phone, the crushing pressure in his chest eased just a little. Farther up the beach, a woman's voice called out, Annie? The girl turned quickly. I'm here, Mom. Daniel looked up as a woman walked toward them from the boardwalk path. She moved with calm alertness, the posture of a parent who had been watching carefully from a distance. Annie waved. Daniel wiped the corner of his eye quietly. The woman approached and gave an apologetic smile. I hope she wasn't bothering you. Daniel looked down at the tiny shell house in the sand. Then he shook his head. No, he said softly. Actually, she helped more than she knows. A gentle wave rolled toward the shore, touching the end of Annie's little sand path before retreating again into the endless ocean. Marianne looked surprised. "Well," she said, glancing at her daughter. "That sounds like Annie." Annie beamed proudly and brushed sand from her hands. "Mom, we're building a house for the ocean," she explained. "For the ocean?" Marianne repeated. "Yes," Annie said very seriously. "Sometimes it gets lonely." Marianne laughed softly and turned back to Daniel. "She has a habit of making friends with everything." "That's not a bad habit," Daniel said. For a moment they all stood quietly while a wave rolled in and stopped just short of the little sand path Annie had drawn. Marianne crouched beside her daughter. "Did you ask the gentleman if he wanted to help?" Annie nodded enthusiastically. "He already did." She pointed at the shell Daniel had placed beside the others. Marianne looked at it and then back at him. "Well, thank you for being patient with her." "It wasn't patience," Daniel said after a small pause. "It was good timing." Marianne seemed to sense there was more behind that sentence, but she didn't pry. Instead, she offered her hand. "I'm Marianne, by the way." Daniel stood slowly and shook it. "Daniel." Marianne nodded. "Nice to meet you." Annie tilted her head and looked between them. "You didn't say your last name," she told Daniel. Daniel smiled faintly. "That's true." He hesitated only a moment before adding, "It's Whitaker. Daniel Whitaker." Marianne's expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but just enough that Daniel recognized the moment of recognition. Most adults eventually placed the name. "Oh," she said quietly. "I've heard of you." Daniel gave a small shrug. "Most people have if they read business news." Annie blinked up at him. "You're famous?" Daniel chuckled softly. "Not the fun kind." Annie thought about that. "My teacher says famous people are just regular people who get talked about a lot." Daniel smiled. "That's probably the most accurate description I've heard." Annie crouched down again beside the shell house. "Do famous people build sand houses?" she asked. "Not often," Daniel admitted. "Maybe they should." Daniel looked down at the tiny structure again. "You might be right." Marianne brushed sand off her hands and glanced toward the boardwalk. "We were just taking a walk," she explained. "Annie likes collecting shells." Annie lifted the red bucket proudly. "I found 23. 24. Marianne corrected. "You gave one to the dog earlier. That one didn't count." Daniel laughed quietly. The sound surprised him. He hadn't expected to laugh today. His phone buzzed in the sand beside him. He ignored it. Annie noticed immediately. "Is your phone mad at you?" she asked. Daniel looked at the screen briefly. 3 missed calls. Robert Hale, his lawyer. Daniel flipped the phone face down again. "You could say that." Marianne raised an eyebrow. "Work trouble?" "Something like that." She nodded sympathetically. "Those days happen." Daniel looked out at the ocean again. "They seem to happen more when you sign very large contracts." Marianne studied him for a moment. "You're the businessman," Annie was trying to cheer up. "That's me." Annie looked pleased. "See, Mom? I told you he was sad." Marianne Sihil softly. "Well, at least you're honest." Daniel watched Annie press another shell into the sand. "You take beach architecture very seriously," he said. She nodded. "Strong houses matter." "Why?" "So they don't fall down when the waves come." Daniel felt that sentence settle heavily inside him. If this moment touched your heart, take a second to like this video, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us what really matters in life. Marianne noticed the change in his expression. "You okay?" she asked gently. Daniel nodded slowly. "I will be." The wind shifted across the beach. The sun had begun to dip lower toward the horizon, painting the water with streaks of orange and silver. Families nearby began gathering their things. Evening was coming. Annie studied the tiny house again. "The walls need one more shell." Daniel scanned the sand and picked one up nearby. He handed it to her. "There you go." She placed it carefully into the side of the house and leaned back to admire the finished shape. "Perfect," she said. Daniel looked at it thoughtfully. "Do you think it will survive the tide?" Annie shrugged. "Maybe. That's not very confident." She grinned. "If it falls down tomorrow, we can build another one." Daniel felt something shift inside his chest again. Such a simple idea. Build again. Marianne stood up and brushed sand from her jeans. "We should probably head home," she said. Annie grabbed her bucket. Then she looked back at Daniel. "Are you going to be okay, Mr. Whitaker?" Daniel hesitated. Then he nodded. "I think I will." She seemed satisfied with that answer. Good. She turned and took a few steps toward the boardwalk before waving back. Bye, Daniel. He raised a hand. Bye, Annie. Mariana gave him one last polite smile. Take care. You too. They walked away together up the path. Daniel remained standing there for a moment, listening to the waves. The beach grew quieter. He looked down at the tiny shell house again. Daniel picked up his phone. Robert Hale's name still glowed on the screen. He slipped the phone into his pocket and looked at the ocean one more time. Strong houses matter, he murmured to himself. Then he turned and began walking toward the boardwalk. Daniel had driven less than 10 minutes before his phone started ringing again. This time he answered, Robert. His lawyer did not bother with hello. Where the hell have you been? Daniel kept one hand on the steering wheel as he eased his black SUV onto Pacific Coast Highway. Evening traffic had thickened, headlights beginning to streak against the fading California light. To his right, the ocean was still visible in flashes between parked cars and palm trunks, darkening by the minute. At the beach, Daniel said. There was a short silence on the other end. The beach, Robert repeated flatly. Yes. Robert let out a long breath that sounded dangerously close to a prayer for patience. Daniel, I have spent the last hour trying to keep your executive team from tearing each other apart. Your CFO is in panic mode. Investor Relations wants a statement before Asian markets open, and half the board is already asking whether Victor Lang set this up from the beginning. Daniel's jaw tightened. He did. Another silence. You're sure? I'm sure enough to say it out loud. Robert's voice lowered immediately, shifting from irritation to focus. Then turn around and get to the office. I've got copies of the revised contract, the email trail we could recover, and enough red flags to make me physically ill. Daniel merged into the left lane. I'm on my way. You sound strange. Daniel almost smiled. I had an unexpected conversation. With whom? A 6-year-old. Robert said nothing. Daniel added, she was smarter than most people in my boardroom. That earned a tired huff of laughter. Good. Maybe bring her to the emergency meeting. By the time Daniel reached downtown Los Angeles, the city had fully shifted into night. Glass towers reflected the last violet traces of sunset. Restaurant patios glowed warm against the cooling air. Traffic lights flickered over long lines of brake lights and impatient drivers. Whitaker Ventures occupied the top 11 floors of a sleek tower in Century City. All steel, glass, and immaculate control. Normally, the building made Daniel feel powerful. Tonight, it looked like a machine waiting to judge him. He parked in the private underground garage, rode the elevator to the 31st floor, and stepped out into a reception area that was far too bright for the kind of day he'd had. A few assistants were still at their desks, speaking in lowered voices. Heads turned when he walked in. People stood straighter. Screens were minimized. The air changed. That part of power had always exhausted him. Robert Hale was waiting outside the conference room, tie loosened, reading glasses low on his nose, one hand wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. Robert had been with Daniel since the second year of Whitaker Ventures, back when the company was still small enough to fit its legal team into a single office. He was in his early 60s now, silver-haired, sharp-minded, and stubborn in a way Daniel had long ago learned to trust. You look terrible, Robert said as Daniel approached. Nice to see you too. You smell like seawater. Daniel handed him his jacket. That would be because I was at the beach. Robert stared at him for one beat, then opened the conference room door. Inside, the atmosphere was worse than Daniel expected. 3 members of his executive team sat around the long walnut table, laptops open, faces strained. Financial models glowed across the wall monitors. Red numbers everywhere. Loss projections, exposure charts, headlines already forming in digital news feeds along the right-hand screen. Daniel did not sit immediately. He walked to the far end of the table, set both hands against the polished surface, and looked at the projections. How bad? He asked. His CFO, Linda Marquez, answered first. If Lang Capital forces the current interpretation of the liability clause, we absorb almost the entire infrastructure overrun. That means immediate losses in the 9 figures and potentially more if creditors decide we concealed material risk. We didn't conceal anything, Daniel said. That won't stop them from saying it. His head of investor relations, Sam Bennett, leaned forward. The market won't wait for nuance. There's already chatter online that Whitaker got greedy. If we don't control the narrative by morning, Victor will. Daniel turned to Robert. Show me. Robert tapped a key on his tablet, and one of the wall screens shifted to a marked-up contract. Section 14, Robert said. The revised risk allocation language. It was inserted in the final round and disguised as a harmonizing amendment tied to municipal compliance. Your outside team reviewed it against the earlier draft but didn't flag the cross-reference buried in Appendix C. Linda spoke through clenched teeth. Because Appendix C was moved. Robert nodded. Exactly. On purpose. Daniel stared at the screen. The legal language was elegant in the most poisonous way. Smooth, technical, and crafted to be missed by anyone not specifically hunting for a knife. Victor had not won by force. He had won by patience. Daniel felt the old anger rise again, but now it was clearer, colder, more useful. Who else has seen this? He asked. Just us, Robert said. And I'd like to keep it that way until we decide whether we're negotiating, litigating, or preparing for war. Sam muttered. It's already war. Daniel finally took his seat. The leather chair felt unfamiliar tonight, as if it belonged to a man he had been this morning and wasn't quite anymore. He looked around the table. Linda, fierce and precise, who had worked 80-hour weeks for him and missed more family dinners than any person should. Sam, smooth under pressure, though sweat was gathering at his temples now. Robert, who had once told Daniel that the most dangerous moment in any empire was when the man at the top began believing he could no longer be touched. Maybe this was that moment. Daniel leaned back slowly. Victor wants panic, he said. He wants us loud, reactive, divided, and scared enough to accept his version of rescue. Linda nodded. That sounds right. So we don't give him that. Sam frowned. We still need a statement. You'll get one, Daniel said. But not tonight. Tonight we gather facts. Robert studied him. What changed? Daniel looked at the contract again but saw, for a brief and impossible second, a tiny shell doorway set into wet sand. Strong houses matter. If it falls down tomorrow, we can build another one. He almost laughed at himself. What changed, he said quietly, is that I remembered panic doesn't build anything. It only tears down what's left. Linda exchanged a glance with Robert. No one spoke. Daniel straightened in his chair. I want every communication between Lang Capital and our legal review team pulled by midnight. I want a timeline of every version of this contract. I want to know who touched Appendix C, who approved the last-minute changes, and whether Victor made similar moves in any of his prior developments. Robert nodded. Already started. Good. Linda, freeze any optional transfers tied to the redevelopment project. Sam, draft a holding statement for release at 6 a.m. Nothing defensive. Nothing emotional. We say we are reviewing newly surfaced contractual issues and will address investors once that review is complete. Sam typed quickly. Understood. Daniel paused, then added, and no anonymous quotes to press. Nobody leaks. Nobody speculates. The room settled. Not calm, exactly, but steadier. Direction had a way of doing that. After another 40 minutes of task assignments and damage control, the meeting finally broke. Linda left first, still talking into her phone. Sam headed for his office to begin drafting statements. Robert remained behind, gathering papers into neat piles. Daniel stood by the window, looking down at the city lights. From this height, Los Angeles looked almost peaceful. Robert came to stand beside him. You really did go to the beach, he said after a moment. I really did. And a 6-year-old made you philosophical. Daniel glanced at him. You'd have liked her. Robert smiled faintly. What was her name? Annie. And what exactly did Annie say that got through all that expensive executive armor? Daniel looked back at the city. She told me sometimes strangers need kindness the most. Robert was quiet for a few seconds. Smart kid. She built a shell house for the ocean. Robert nodded as if that made complete sense. Naturally. Daniel slipped one hand into his pocket and felt a grain of sand still caught in the cuff of his trousers. It should have annoyed him. Instead, it grounded him. For the first time all evening, he allowed himself to imagine tomorrow not as an ending, but as the beginning of a fight. And somewhere beneath the legal language, the headlines, and the damage estimates, that thought carried something dangerously close to hope. Daniel Whitaker woke before the alarm. For a few seconds, he lay still in the quiet darkness of his bedroom, staring at the ceiling as the faint blue glow of early morning slipped through the curtains. His mind was already moving, assembling problems before the day had even begun. Victor Lang, the contract, the press, investors, damage control. It all came back immediately. Daniel sat up slowly and rubbed his eyes. The ocean air from the evening before still lingered faintly in his memory, the sound of waves, the smell of salt, the small shell house pressed into the sand, and a little girl's voice. If it falls down tomorrow, we can build another one. Daniel exhaled and swung his feet onto the floor. He had built companies from scratch before. Rebuilding was not the frightening part. The frightening part was discovering who had been quietly setting the fire. By the time Daniel arrived at the Whitaker Ventures Tower again, the city was fully awake. Traffic crawled along Century Park West. Delivery trucks rumbled past coffee shops already filled with early commuters. Inside the office, the mood had shifted from shock to controlled urgency. Screens flickered with spreadsheets. Assistants moved quickly between desks. The quiet hum of crisis management had begun. Robert Hale was already inside the conference room again, sleeves rolled up, reading glasses on, surrounded by printed pages and legal binders. "You slept?" Robert asked, without looking up. "Barely." "Good. That means you're still human." Daniel dropped his briefcase onto the table. "What did we find?" Robert slid a stack of documents toward him. "Enough to confirm your suspicion." Daniel flipped through the pages. Highlighted emails, legal revisions, timeline notes. Victor Lang's fingerprints were everywhere. 3 other projects, Robert said. Different partners, similar clause structures. Each time the liability quietly shifted to the other side. Right before the deal finalized, Daniel frowned. "And nobody noticed?" "They noticed eventually, just not before the damage was done." Daniel set the papers down. "So this is his business model?" Robert nodded. "Elegant fraud wrapped in legal ambiguity." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "How exposed are we?" "Bad, but not fatal," Robert replied. "Your company has enough liquidity to absorb the first hit. The real danger is reputation." Daniel already knew that. Markets were brutal about weakness. Fear spread faster than truth. Sam Bennett hurried into the room holding a tablet. "The press is starting to move," he said. Daniel took the tablet. A financial news headline glowed across the screen. "Whitaker Ventures project collapses. Investors demand answers." Another one followed seconds later. "Did tech billionaire Daniel Whitaker overreach?" Daniel handed the tablet back. "That was fast." "It's going to get worse by noon," Sam said. Daniel stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the city. Traffic moved in slow lines far below. Los Angeles didn't stop for anyone's problems. Robert spoke behind him. "Victor's team scheduled a press conference this afternoon." Daniel turned. "That's aggressive. He's framing this as your miscalculation." "Of course he was. Control the story early, and the public would remember your version." Daniel walked back to the table. "Then we beat him to it." Sam looked up. "You want to respond publicly?" "Yes." Robert frowned slightly. "Careful. I'm not panicking," Daniel said. "But we're not hiding either." He leaned over the table. "Victor expects us to scramble quietly while he shapes the narrative." Sam nodded slowly. "That does sound like him." Daniel tapped one of the documents. "We expose the pattern." Robert crossed his arms. "You want to accuse him directly?" "I want to ask questions publicly." Robert studied him carefully. "That's a dangerous game." Daniel shrugged. "So is letting a predator run the table." For a moment the room was silent. Then Robert smiled faintly. "There's the man I've worked with for 15 years. Sam started typing quickly. "Okay. If we do this, we need timing." Daniel nodded. "Noon, statement." Sam blinked. "That's soon." "Exactly." Robert leaned forward. "Let me review the language first." Daniel nodded. "Do it." Sam hurried out of the room. Robert gathered the documents again. "You seem calmer than last night," he said. Daniel considered that. "I am." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Because of Annie?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Partly." Robert chuckled. "A 6-year-old beach philosopher." Daniel looked down at the table, remembering the tiny shell doorway pressed into the sand. "She said something interesting." "Oh? Strong houses matter." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "Smart kid." Daniel added quietly, "And if one falls down, you build another." Robert closed the folder. That's not bad advice for corporate warfare either. Daniel picked up his jacket. I'm stepping out for 10 minutes. Robert frowned. Where? Coffee. Robert stared at him. You're about to walk into the biggest legal fight of your career and you're getting coffee? Daniel smiled. Yes. Robert shook his head slowly. You really did change overnight. Daniel walked toward the door. Maybe I just remembered something important. What's that? Daniel paused at the doorway. That panic doesn't build anything. Robert nodded. Fair point. Daniel stepped into the hallway. As he passed the reception desk, he noticed a small, decorative bowl sitting on the counter. Inside were polished seashells, probably placed there by some interior designer who thought it added a coastal touch to the office aesthetic. Daniel picked one up. It looked surprisingly similar to the shell he had pressed into Annie's tiny sand house the evening before. He turned it over in his fingers. Then he placed it gently back in the bowl. Outside, the California sun was already climbing into a clear blue sky. Daniel Whitaker stepped into the morning with a steady mind and a fight ahead of him. And somewhere along the Santa Monica shoreline, a small shell house was still facing the ocean. By 11:30, Whitaker Ventures no longer felt like a company. It felt like a bunker. Assistants moved quickly and spoke in lowered voices. Phones rang, stopped, rang again. News alerts flashed across screens in reception. Somewhere down the hall, someone dropped a stack of folders, and the sharp slap of paper hitting tile made two junior associates jump like a gun had gone off. Daniel Whitaker stood in the conference room with his sleeves rolled up, reading the draft statement Sam Bennett had prepared for noon. It was clean, controlled, cautious, too cautious. He read the final paragraph again, then handed the page back. This sounds like we're apologizing for being attacked, Daniel said. Sam took the page with a tight expression. It sounds like we're being legally careful. Robert Hale, seated at the far end of the table with his glasses halfway down his nose, looked up from the file he'd been annotating. Sam isn't wrong. Daniel walked toward the windows and stared down at Century City shimmering under the noon sun. Everything below looked orderly. Cars moved. Pedestrians crossed. Valets opened doors. Lunch reservations were kept. Deals were made. The city always looked clean from high enough up. He had spent most of his life living at that height. Now he was starting to wonder how much rot he'd missed by doing so. I'm not asking for reckless, he said at last. I'm asking for spine. Sam shifted his weight. Then tell me what you wanted to say. Daniel turned. He didn't answer right away. On the screen behind them, a financial network had placed Victor Lang's headshot beside his own, the chyron beneath it already sharpening the story into something simple and cruel. Whitaker faces questions after failed coastal deal. Victor, with his silver hair, disciplined smile, and old money stillness, looked every inch the composed statesman of capital, a man who had probably already chosen his tie for the afternoon press conference. Daniel knew men like Victor. They weaponized calm. They let other people look emotional, unstable, guilty. Not this time. He went back to the table and braced both hands against it. I want this in the statement, he said. We have identified significant irregularities in final contract revisions associated with the redevelopment agreement. We are conducting an immediate review of those changes and of related transactions. Until that review is complete, we will not speculate, but we will not be silent. Sam typed quickly, then glanced up. That's stronger. That's the point. Robert tapped a pen against the table. The word irregularities gives us room. I can live with that. Daniel nodded. He had learned long ago that language mattered most when the ground was moving under your feet. Sam cleared his throat. And if they ask whether Lang Capital intentionally concealed material risk, Daniel's face hardened. Then I say we are investigating every possibility. Robert watched him for a long moment. You're ready to make this public. Daniel looked at him. I'm ready to stop acting like silence is dignity. That landed in the room harder than he'd intended. Sam glanced down. Robert said nothing. For just a second, Daniel heard Annie's voice again, soft and certain beneath the sound of the surf. Sometimes strangers need kindness the most. Funny, he thought, how the mind chose its anchors. In the middle of market chaos and legal warfare, what kept returning to him was not strategy, but a little girl placing shells in the sand as if small acts still mattered. Maybe they did. Maybe that was the whole problem with men like Victor Lang. They believed only large things mattered. Money, leverage, headlines, control. They forgot what ordinary people remembered instinctively. That trust was built one small choice at a time, and betrayal began the same way. Sam's phone buzzed. He checked it and looked up immediately. Victor's team just advanced the press conference. 12:15. Daniel checked the wall clock. 11:38. Of course they did, Robert muttered. Sam was already moving toward the door. I'll send the statement in 10. 5, Daniel said. Sam gave a tight nod and disappeared into the hallway. Robert remained seated, studying Daniel the way he sometimes did in the old days, when Whitaker Ventures was just 4 ambitious people in borrowed office space, and Daniel was still young enough to confuse exhaustion with invincibility. You know what Victor wants, Robert said. Daniel did not look away from the windows. Yes, he wants you angry. I am angry. I know, but he wants you publicly angry. Defensive. Sharp. Just controlled enough to look arrogant, and just emotional enough to look guilty. Daniel slipped one hand into his pocket. A grain of sand, somehow still trapped there from the beach, pressed against his fingertips. He closed his hand around it. I'm not giving him that. Robert leaned back. Good. Daniel turned from the glass. What else? Robert opened a separate folder. We found 2 shell companies tied to a trust in Nevada. Both intersect with contractors on Victor's last Phoenix project. The money trail isn't complete yet, but if it connects the way I think it does, he's been moving risk and skimming margin through back channels for years. Daniel let out a low breath. How many people knew? Hard to say. Robert removed his glasses. Enough to build the structure. Not enough to stop it. Daniel nodded slowly. That sounded right too. Corruption rarely required an army. Just a few people willing to look away while someone confident did the stealing. His office phone lit up, then his cell, almost at the same moment. He checked the screen. Linda Marquez. He answered immediately. Linda. Her voice came fast. We've got movement. What kind? 3 institutional investors just requested emergency calls for this afternoon, but that's not the real problem. One of Victor's analysts is feeding language to reporters that implies you personally pushed the final revisions after internal objections. Daniel went still. That's a lie. I know it's a lie. Robert was on his feet now, reading Daniel's expression. Linda continued. There's more. They're hinting this isn't just bad judgment, it's ego. Overreach. Founder syndrome. The usual poison. Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second. There it was. Not just attack the deal, attack the man. If the public could be made to believe this was Daniel Whitaker finally brought low by his own arrogance, then every future defense would sound like pride refusing to die gracefully. It was elegant. It was vicious. And it was exactly the sort of thing Victor would do before lunch. When do the calls start? Daniel asked. 2 p.m. I'm trying to hold them. Hold them. He ended the call and looked at Robert. They're going after credibility. Robert's jaw shifted. Then we answer with facts. Daniel laughed once, without humor. Facts are slower than accusation. Yes, Robert said evenly. But they last longer. For a moment, neither man spoke. Outside, a helicopter moved across the skyline. Sun flashed across nearby glass. Somewhere in the office, a printer started spitting out pages at machine gun speed. Daniel suddenly felt very tired. Not the physical sort of tired, though that was there too. This was older than that. The exhaustion of realizing how many years he had spent mastering growth, expansion, acquisition, while leaving softer things underdeveloped discernment. Maybe. Humility. The ability to see danger before it put on a silk tie and sat across the table smiling. He thought of Annie again. You don't have to tell me everything. But I can sit here with you anyway. There had been no performance in her kindness. No agenda. No calculation. Just the stubborn human instinct to sit beside pain instead of stepping around it. Daniel wondered when adults forgot how to do that. Sam returned with a final printed copy of the statement. Ready. Daniel took it, read it once, and this time did not change a word. Send it. Sam left again. Robert watched him. You're thinking about something. Daniel folded the paper neatly and set it down. I'm thinking, he said, that Victor built his whole life like a man who believes nobody will ever look under the floorboards. Robert's mouth twitched. That's a good line. I'm not trying to be poetic. No, Robert said, reaching for his coffee. "But you're getting there." At 12:03, the statement went live. Within 90 seconds, screens across the office began updating. Anchors changed tone. Articles refreshed. Analysts posted reactions. Whitaker Ventures, the same company that had looked cornered an hour earlier, had now publicly signaled that the collapse might not be incompetence after all. It might be sabotage. Sam reappeared in the doorway. "It's working." Daniel glanced at the financial network on the wall. One anchor was already revising her language. Newly identified irregularities. Questions now turning toward the contract process. If Whitaker can substantiate, not victory, not even close, but movement. A crack in the version of reality Victor had hoped to install before anyone could object. Robert checked his watch. 12:15. On the center screen, Victor Lang stepped behind a podium in a polished press room 2 miles away, looking calm, grave, and perfectly prepared. Daniel folded his arms and watched. Victor adjusted the microphone. "Good afternoon," he began, his tone full of regret so expensive it almost glittered. "Let me first say how disappointed I am by the recent developments surrounding this project." Daniel's eyes narrowed. The war had officially started. Victor Lang looked exactly the way men like him always looked when they were about to lie in public, with sorrow arranged neatly across the face and confidence tucked beneath it like a hidden blade. Daniel stood motionless near the conference room screen, arms folded, while Victor adjusted the microphone and let the room settle around him. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras locked in. The blue backdrop behind the podium carried the logo of Lang Capital and a slogan about building tomorrow responsibly. Daniel almost laughed. Victor lowered his eyes for a fraction of a second, as if gathering himself. "Good afternoon," he said, voice smooth and regretful. "Let me first say how disappointed I am by the recent developments surrounding this project, and by the financial uncertainty now facing employees, investors, and communities that believed in its promise." Sam Bennett muttered under his breath. "He's opening with concern for the little people." Classic. Robert Hale said nothing. He was already making notes. Victor continued. "At Lang Capital, we entered this partnership in good faith. We trusted the process. We trusted the structure. And we trusted the leadership of Whitaker Ventures to carry out the obligations they had expressly agreed to." Daniel's jaw tightened. There it was. Not an accusation blunt enough to be challenged in one sentence. Something subtler. Something polished for television. Whitaker Ventures, leadership, obligations. Point the audience toward guilt and let their own assumptions do the rest. Victor paused, lifted one hand, and gave the crowd the expression of a disappointed statesman. "I do not believe this is a moment for panic," he said. "But I do believe it is a moment for accountability." On the screen behind him, a chart appeared. Selective numbers, carefully framed overruns, highlighted liabilities. Nothing technically false. Nothing honestly true. Daniel stared at it, then reached for the remote and muted the screen. The silence inside the conference room felt heavier than Victor's voice had. Sam turned first. "He's good. He's practiced," Robert corrected. Daniel walked toward the table, picked up a copy of the statement they had already released, and set it down again without reading it. He already knew every word. "What's the market doing?" he asked. Linda Marquez, joining by speakerphone from the 33rd floor, answered immediately. "Holding. Surprisingly. Some drop, but not a collapse. Your statement bought us space." "Space is good," Daniel said. "Not if he fills it faster than we do." Robert glanced toward the muted screen where Victor's mouth still moved in calm, measured shapes. "He's not just defending himself," Robert said. "He's baiting you." Daniel knew that. Victor wanted a reaction. He wanted the story to become emotional, personal, theatrical. If Daniel lashed out too fast, then every reporter in the city would frame it as a wounded billionaire refusing to accept the consequences of his own arrogance. Daniel looked through the glass wall of the conference room into the outer office beyond. People moved quickly, but not chaotically. Phones, screens, clipped voices, legal folders. Crisis had a rhythm, and this was now the tempo of his life. He thought, unexpectedly, of Annie's small hands pressing shells into wet sand. Now it's stronger. It was absurd that this kept coming back to him, and yet it did. Not because it was cute, because it was true. You didn't reinforce fragile things by kicking at them. You reinforce them by placing one steady piece beside another. Daniel turned back to Robert. What's he not saying? Robert didn't need to think long. He's not denying involvement in the revisions. He's not addressing timeline authorship. He's not mentioning the shell entities. Daniel nodded. Good. Sam frowned. Good? It means he still thinks he can stay one step above specifics. Robert's expression sharpened. And that gives us room to drag him into them. Daniel walked to the head of the table and sat down. Call the forensic team. Sam blinked. The outside firm? Yes. Robert nodded slowly, already following the thought. Independent review. Exactly. Daniel looked at Linda's blinking line on the speakerphone. And I want every cost transfer related to the redevelopment project mapped visually. If Victor built this the way I think he did, the money trail won't just exist. It'll repeat. Linda answered. I'll have my team working on it within the hour. Daniel muted the speaker for a moment and looked at both men in the room. He's counting on two things, Daniel said. First, that he can make this about me before it becomes about the deal. Second, that the public will get bored before the details catch up. Sam nodded reluctantly. He may not be wrong. Then we make the details impossible to ignore. Robert's mouth twitched faintly. There he is. Daniel leaned back in his chair, but there was no comfort in it. He was thinking ahead now. Not just to the next statement or the next interview, but to structure, narrative, evidence. What could be proven, and when? What would matter to the public, and what would only matter in court? Men like Victor survived because they understood a very American weakness. People preferred simple stories to complicated truths. If a powerful man in a tailored suit told the cameras he was disappointed, and another powerful man looked angry in response, most viewers would decide in 10 seconds which one seemed more trustworthy. Facts were slower, but facts, if assembled correctly, could still win. The muted press conference ended. Victor stepped back from the podium to a cluster of shouted questions. One reporter rose above the noise. Mr. Lang, did your team request the final liability language? Victor smiled with elegant patience. I think now is the time for cooperation, not finger-pointing. Daniel unmuted just long enough to hear it, then muted again. Robert let out a low breath. That line alone tells me he's worried. Why? Because innocent men answer the question. Daniel stood again. His office felt too small all of a sudden. The air too conditioned. The windows too sealed. He moved toward the corridor and stopped at the reception desk outside, where the decorative bowl of polished shells still sat beneath soft lighting. He picked one up, white, smooth, ordinary, completely out of place in a billion-dollar office tower. Robert appeared behind him. You really are thinking about that beach. Daniel turned the shell in his fingers. A little girl asked me yesterday why adults are so afraid of things falling apart. Robert waited. She said if something falls down, you build it again. Robert gave a small nod. Reasonable position. Daniel looked at him. What if that's not enough? For business? Robert asked. For life. That earned a longer pause. Robert slipped his hands into his pockets and stared through the lobby glass toward the elevators. Then you figure out whether what fell apart was ever built honestly in the first place. Daniel went still. It was the kind of answer Robert gave only when he wasn't trying to sound wise. And because of that, it landed. Daniel looked down at the shell again. Had he built honestly? Mostly, yes. He believed that. He had worked for what he had. He had carried risk, created jobs, made decisions that built tangible things in the world. But honesty was not just about effort. It was also about sight, about what a man chose not to see when the numbers were good and the growth looked clean. Victor Lang had not entered Daniel's world by force. He had been invited. That truth sat hard in Daniel's chest. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A text from an unknown number. It read, I don't usually do this, but if you're really looking at Lang's contract history, ask about Phoenix Harbor Phase 2. Someone died trying to stop the overruns. Be careful. Daniel read it twice, then a third time. Robert watched his face change. What? Daniel handed him the phone. Robert read the message, and for the first time that day, even he looked rattled. Could be a crank, Robert said. Could be. But, Daniel slid the shell back into the bowl. But people don't usually invent specific dead bodies when they're bluffing. Robert exhaled slowly. Phoenix Harbor Phase 2, he repeated. I'll have someone pull everything. No, Daniel said. Robert looked up. No interns, no junior staff, no leaks, you and me. Robert's gaze held his for a moment. Then he nodded once. All right. Daniel looked back toward the conference room where screens still glowed with red numbers, statements, and the face of the man trying to bury him in public. The fight had just changed shape. This was no longer only about a failed contract. This was about a pattern, maybe even blood beneath the paperwork. And somewhere under the machinery of the day, Daniel felt the first real spark of something colder than anger and far more useful. Purpose. Daniel did not go home that night. By 8:30, most of Whitaker Ventures had emptied out, the polished hallways settling into the eerie quiet of a building designed for power but not for exhaustion. Cleaning crews moved discreetly through the outer offices with rolling carts and low voices. Downtown lights shimmered beyond the glass, cold and distant, reflecting back at him from every window, like a city that preferred money to truth. Inside Daniel's private office, the lamps were dimmed. His tie lay tossed across the back of a chair. The top button of his shirt had been undone for hours. On the low table by the window sat 2 cups of coffee, both going cold. Robert Hale stood with his reading glasses low on his nose, scanning documents on a tablet while Daniel leaned against the edge of his desk, arms folded, staring at a printed project file marked Phoenix Harbor Phase Ek. The anonymous text sat between them like a lit fuse. Someone died trying to stop the overruns. Be careful. Robert lowered the tablet slightly. I pulled the public filings, archived reporting, old permit records, and internal notes from the Phoenix development. At first glance, it looks exactly like every other overbuilt coastal project from the last 10 years. Daniel looked up. At first glance, Robert nodded. At second glance, it looks worse. He walked over and set the tablet on the desk, then slid a printed timeline toward Daniel. Phoenix Harbor was positioned as a mixed-use waterfront revitalization project. Affordable units, public walkways, environmental compliance, all the usual language. Lang Capital came in late, reshaped the financing structure, then cost estimates started moving. Daniel scanned the page. Revised contractors, delayed reporting, reallocated funds, design amendments, emergency adjustments. So where's the death? He asked. Robert pointed to a single highlighted name near the bottom. Ethan Cole. Daniel frowned. Who was he? Project Risk Analyst. 34. Former Army Corps of Engineers consultant. Hired 6 months before construction escalated. Robert flipped to another page. According to internal reporting, Cole raised written concerns about structural shortcuts, contractor substitutions, and undocumented transfers tied to shoreline reinforcement. 2 weeks later, he was dead. Daniel straightened. How? Officially, Robert said. Single car accident outside Mesa at 11:40 p.m. Driver fatigue suspected. Daniel's silence deepened. And, unofficially? Robert took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Unofficially, there were rumors at the time that he'd been preparing to escalate concerns beyond his immediate chain of command. But the story died fast. Local coverage. No major follow-through. Family asked for privacy. Daniel stared at the name again. Ethan Cole, 34 years old, a man with a job title bland enough to disappear, a death tidy enough not to interrupt anyone's quarterly reporting. He felt something cold slide beneath his ribs. Not shock exactly. Not yet. Recognition. This was how powerful men survived. Not by making problems vanish completely, only by making them vanish long enough. Robert looked at him carefully. Daniel. He didn't answer. Robert's voice sharpened just slightly. Don't leap ahead of the facts. Daniel let out a slow breath. I know, but he also knew this much. Anonymous texts rarely came from nowhere. People stayed quiet for years, then cracked open over one detail, one headline, one public lie too many. Maybe Victor's press conference had pushed somebody over the edge. Maybe somebody had been waiting a long time for the right person to notice. Daniel moved toward the window, one hand in his pocket. Down below, brake lights pooled red at intersections. Somewhere out there, people were eating dinner, folding laundry, arguing over bills, helping children with homework, watching late local news with the volume too loud, real life, untouched by legal language and executive warfare. He thought, suddenly and uninvited, of Annie again, her little red bucket, the seriousness with which she had placed each shell, the calm certainty in her voice when she said she could listen, even if she didn't understand. You don't have to tell me everything, but I can still listen. He had spent most of his adult life around people who spoke to be useful, impressive, strategic, persuasive. It was unsettling to realize how much power there was in someone willing simply to listen without trying to control the outcome. Robert began organizing papers into piles. "We need to make a decision," he said. "Do we pursue Phoenix quietly as leverage, or do we widen this and risk pulling a corpse into a live financial war?" Daniel turned from the glass. He had a name. Robert paused. "Ethan Cole had a name," Daniel said. "He's not just leverage." Robert held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "Fair." Daniel came back to the desk. "What about family?" "A sister in Flagstaff, parents deceased, no spouse, no children." Robert hesitated. There was also a fiancé at the time. Engagement ended shortly before the death, according to a local piece. Daniel looked down at the file again. He was old enough to know that tragedy rarely arrived alone. It took pieces. Work, future, trust, love, then left the remains looking accidental. Robert slid another sheet forward. "Here's what bothers me most. 3 days before he died, Cole sent a request for a private meeting with someone inside Lang Capital's oversight arm. No record the meeting happened. Who received it?" Robert tapped the name. Victor Lang. That landed hard. Daniel read it twice to make sure he wasn't seeing what anger wanted to see. Victor Lang. Direct. Not buried 6 names down in some chain of middle management. Not plausibly distant. Daniel's mouth flattened into a line. So Ethan Cole saw something, documented concerns, and tried to reach Victor directly. That's what it looks like. And then he died. Robert said nothing. Neither man needed the rest spoken aloud. The office fell quiet except for the distant hum of ventilation and the faint rattle of a cleaning cart somewhere in the hallway. Daniel picked up the printed page and read the final internal note attached to Ethan Cole's name. Employment status closed. Matter resolved. He almost laughed. Matter resolved. There it was again, that language powerful institutions used when they wanted to turn human damage into paperwork. Matter resolved. He set the paper down very carefully. "No," he said. Robert looked up. "No what?" "No quiet leverage. No back-channel scare tactic. No using this to get Victor to settle and disappear." Robert studied him. "If there's truth here," Daniel went on, "then this stops being about saving face. It stops being about recovering losses. It becomes about whether a man like Victor Lang gets to keep walking into rooms and talking about accountability, while other people get buried under his projects." Robert folded his arms. "That's a bigger war. I know. It will also become personal." Daniel gave him a humorless smile. "Robert, he made it personal yesterday." Robert considered that, then gave a small nod of reluctant agreement. Daniel sank into the chair behind his desk for the first time all evening. Fatigue hit him hard now, but not the same way as the day before. Yesterday, he had been hollowed out by failure. Tonight, the exhaustion came with direction. He looked at the file, then at the city beyond the glass. "When I was a kid," he said quietly, "my father used to say rich men don't get ruined by enemies. They get ruined by the people they invite close." Robert leaned against the credenza. "Wise man? Not especially." Daniel's mouth shifted faintly. But he was right about that. Dying. Resusted, he thought again of how Victor had entered his world, smiling, polished, competent, speaking the language of disciplined growth and measured ambition. Daniel had not just trusted him, he had respected him. That burned more than the money. A soft knock came at the door. Daniel looked up. One of the overnight assistants stepped in halfway. "Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Whitaker. Reception just forwarded a call. The woman said it wasn't business, but she thought you'd want to know." Daniel frowned. "Who is it?" "She didn't leave a last name. Just said her name is Marianne. She's with Annie." Something in Daniel's expression changed so quickly that Robert noticed it before the assistant did. "Put it through," Daniel said. The assistant nodded and disappeared. Robert's eyebrows rose just slightly. Beach, Annie? Daniel ignored him, though the corner of his mouth nearly moved. A second later, the desk phone lit up. Daniel picked it up. Hello? There was a small pause. Then Marianne's voice came through, warm but uncertain. Hi. I hope this isn't strange. Annie wanted me to call. Daniel glanced once at Robert, who had the decency to look down at his papers. No, Daniel said, his voice unexpectedly softer. It's not strange. In the background, he could hear a child's muffled excitement. Marianne lowered her voice slightly. She was worried about you. Daniel looked down at Ethan Cole's file, then across his desk at the shell-white city lights beyond the window. For the first time all day, his throat tightened for reasons that had nothing to do with Victor Lang. What did she want to say? He asked. Marianne gave a little laugh, tired and affectionate. She said to tell you the Ocean House probably made it through the first wave. And if it didn't, she says you know what to do. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Yes, he thought. He did. Daniel kept the phone to his ear a moment longer after Marianne finished speaking. On the other end, he could hear Annie in the background asking a question too far from the receiver to make out clearly. Marianne answered her in a low voice, then returned. She also wanted me to ask if you're still sad, Marianne said. Daniel let out a breath that was almost a laugh. That direct, huh? She believes efficiency is kindness. Something in that line warmed the cold office air around him. Daniel glanced across the desk at Robert, who was pretending not to listen and failing badly. I'm less lost than I was yesterday, Daniel said. That sounds like progress. It might be. There was a small pause. I hope I'm not interrupting, Marianne said. I know you're probably busy. Daniel looked at the files spread out under the lamplight. Phoenix Harbor. Ethan Cole. Lang Capital. Numbers and names and legal rot. You're not interrupting, he said. Actually, this may be the first useful conversation I've had in hours. That earned a soft laugh from her. In the background, Annie's voice rose again, more insistent this time. Marianne sighed with fond surrender. All right, hold on. She wants to say it herself. A brief rustle followed. Then Annie's small voice came bright and immediate through the line. Hi, Daniel. Daniel sat back in his chair. Hi, Annie. Mom said not to keep you too long because grown-up work calls are boring. Robert looked up at that. Daniel turned slightly away so he could smile in peace. She's not entirely wrong. I just wanted to tell you something, Annie said. I'm listening. The Ocean House probably got wet. Annie informed him seriously. But maybe not all the way broken. That's good news. And if it did break, she added, you already know what to do. Daniel's gaze drifted to the dark window. Yes, he thought. Build again. Except rebuilding, he was beginning to understand, sometimes meant tearing open the old foundation first. Thank you, Annie, he said quietly. You're welcome. There was a little pause, then she lowered her voice as if sharing a confidential strategy. When people are mean, my mom says you should tell the truth calm. Because yelling makes mean people look better than they are. Daniel went still. Across from him, Robert caught the shift in his expression. That, Daniel said carefully, is extremely good advice. I know. Annie sounded pleased. Okay. Mom says I have to brush my teeth now. Bye, Daniel. Good night, Annie. Good night. Marianne came back on the line. Sorry about that. Don't be. She hesitated. For what it's worth, I'm glad she ran into you yesterday. Daniel looked down at the shell-white grain of sand still caught near his cuff. So am I. They said goodnight, and Daniel set the phone down slowly. The office felt quieter afterward, though nothing around him had changed. Files still covered the desk. The city still glittered with expensive indifference. Victor Lang was still out there somewhere, undoubtedly sleeping well. But Annie's voice lingered. Tell the truth, calm. Robert took off his glasses and placed them on the desk. She's good, he said. Daniel gave a faint nod. She really is. Robert folded his arms. You look like you just got your strategy from a first grader. A kindergartner, I think. Even better. Daniel leaned back and let the silence settle. Then he looked at Ethan Cole's file again. Tell the truth, calm. It was child's advice. Also, excellent litigation advice. Also, maybe, the only way through this without letting Victor define the emotional terms of the fight. We need to find the person who sent that text. Daniel said. Robert nodded once. I assumed you'd say that. No subpoenas yet. No formal moves. I don't want to spook them. Agreed. Daniel stood and paced once to the window and back. Fatigue tugged at him, but his mind felt sharper than it had that morning. Whoever reached out chose me after the press conference, he said. That means either they think I'm finally paying attention, or they think I'm desperate enough to use anything. Robert considered that. Possibly both. I want them to know I'm listening, not hunting. Robert's brows rose. That's a distinction. It matters. He thought about Marianne too, calling not to ask for anything, not to place herself in his orbit, but because Annie had been worried. No leverage, no networking instinct, no carefully disguised ask, just human concern. That kind of thing had become so rare in Daniel's world that it still startled him. Robert picked up his tablet again. Then we give the sender a way back in. Quietly. How? I can have one of our cyber people trace the number without triggering anything visible. Separately, we could release just enough in tomorrow's messaging to suggest we're reviewing prior Lang projects. If the sender is watching, they may come again. Daniel nodded slowly. Do it. It was nearly 10:30 when Robert finally left. Daniel remained alone another half hour, reading through old Phoenix material until the words blurred. At last, he shut the file, gathered only what he needed, and went home. His house in Brentwood sat behind gates and hedges, and the sort of tasteful exterior wealth that was designed not to boast too loudly. Inside, it was immaculate in the way homes became when no one truly lived in them during daylight. Clean lines, neutral colors, quiet rooms arranged by professionals. A kitchen stocked by staff. Art selected because it signaled discernment. Daniel unlocked the front door and stepped into stillness. For years, he had told himself he preferred it this way. No demands, no compromises, no one leaving a trail of life behind them. Tonight it just felt empty. He loosened his collar as he crossed the foyer and stopped, strangely, at the edge of the formal living room. Through the wide glass doors, he could see the dark outline of the backyard. The pool lights glowed blue beneath the surface. Beyond the wall, somewhere in the distance, traffic murmured like an ocean made of engines. He thought of Annie asking if he was still sad. Still sad was not quite the phrase for it. He was angry, alert, hunted, and hunting. But beneath all that, yes, something older remained. Something he had mistaken for discipline for a very long time. Loneliness, maybe, or the cost of winning too often in rooms where nobody loved you. Daniel went into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stood at the counter without drinking it. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a secure message from Robert. We traced the number. Burner phone purchased cash. Venice kiosk. But there's one useful detail. It pinged twice before the text. Once near Glendale. Once near Santa Monica College. Daniel read it twice. Santa Monica. His mind moved immediately not to Victor, not to the office, but to the beach, to shells, to Annie and Marianne, to the strange fact that in the middle of corporate sabotage and buried death, the only place that had felt honest in the last 48 hours was a stretch of sand where a 6-year-old had decided he looked too sad to sit alone. Another message followed, also found something else. Ethan Cole's former fiancée now teaches part-time at a community college extension program in Santa Monica. Name, Rachel Levin. Daniel set the water glass down. There it was, not proof, but direction. He called Robert immediately. Robert answered on the second ring. I knew you'd call. Rachel Levin, Daniel said. Yes, tomorrow. That was my thought. Daniel looked through the glass doors into the dark backyard. If she's been quiet all these years, she won't talk to lawyers. Probably not. She might talk to someone who finally understands what Victor does to people. Robert was quiet for a beat. That's not a legal approach. No, Daniel said. It's a human one. And if she slams the door, then at least we'll know we tried. Robert exhaled slowly. Fine. We go quietly. No staff. No press. No traceable car service. Daniel almost smiled. You sound like you're planning a bank robbery. At my age, this is more exciting. They agreed on the morning and ended the call. Daniel set the phone down and finally drank the water. It had gone slightly warm, but he didn't care. Tomorrow would bring new headlines, new spins, new attempts by Victor Lang to turn complexity into accusation. But now there was a name, Rachel Levin. And for the first time since this began, Daniel felt the shape of the fight shifting from defense to truth. He turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs, carrying with him an image he had not expected to need. So much a little shell house facing the ocean. Fragile but deliberate, built by a child who believed broken things were not the end of the story. Daniel left his house just after 7 the next morning in a dark gray SUV he almost never drove himself anymore. No driver, no assistant, no security detail. That had been Robert's suggestion, though Daniel suspected it was also a test. Strip away the machinery for one morning and see whether the man inside it still knew how to move through the world without an entourage smoothing the edges. Los Angeles was washed in a pale, early light that made even the freeway ramps look briefly innocent. Coffee shops were filling. Delivery vans crowded side streets. Joggers moved along tree-lined sidewalks in expensive headphones, sealed inside private soundtracks. Daniel drove west first, then cut south toward Santa Monica, keeping one eye on traffic and the other on the address Robert had texted before sunrise. Rachel Levin, part-time instructor, Community Education Annex near Santa Monica College. He should have been preparing for calls with investors. He should have been refining legal posture, reviewing statements, deciding how much of Victor Lang's public narrative needed to be countered before noon. Instead, he was driving toward a woman whose name had almost disappeared behind the death of a man he had never met. That alone told him how much the shape of this fight had changed. Robert was already waiting in the annex parking lot when Daniel arrived, leaning against a practical silver sedan that looked exactly like the kind of car a 62-year-old attorney with more discipline than vanity would own. He held 2 paper coffee cups and wore a navy windbreaker over his usual pressed shirt. "You're late," Robert said as Daniel got out. Daniel looked at his watch. "By 1 minute. At my age, that counts." Daniel took the coffee. "You look underdressed for corporate warfare." "We're not doing corporate warfare this morning. We're asking a grieving woman to talk to 2 strangers about a dead man." Robert's expression hardened slightly. "Dress accordingly." Daniel glanced down at his own clothes. Dark jeans, open-collar blue shirt. No tie, no jacket. He had made the adjustment deliberately and still felt faintly foolish about it. Robert noticed. "You look fine," he said. "Less billionaire, more human." High praise. They started toward the building together. The community annex was a low stucco structure softened by jacaranda trees and a row of sun-faded posters advertising evening classes in accounting, creative writing, and English conversation. Students moved in and out carrying backpacks and coffee, most of them too young and too busy to notice 2 older men walking with unusual purpose toward the reception desk. Inside, the halls smelled faintly of copier, toner, and old books. A secretary in her 50s looked up from behind a cluttered front counter. "Can I help you?" Robert smiled first. He was better at entering rooms without alarming people. "We're looking for Rachel Levin. We understand she teaches here part-time." The secretary studied them, taking in Daniel's face for 1 extra second. Recognition flickered, then was politely hidden. "She has a 9 o'clock seminar," the woman said. "Adult writing workshop. Are you enrolled?" "No," Robert said. "We're here on a personal matter." The secretary hesitated. Daniel stepped forward just enough to soften the moment. "We won't interrupt her class," he said. "We can wait." That seemed to settle something. "She finishes at 10:15, the woman said. "Second floor, room 204. There's seating down the hall." Robert thanked her, and they moved away. They sat on a hard bench outside room 204 while the sounds of a morning class drifted through the thin institutional door. Rachel's voice was clear but too muffled to make out words. Occasionally the room laughed. Once there was silence for a long stretch, the kind that suggested writing time. Daniel held his coffee without drinking it. Robert glanced at him. "Nervous." Daniel considered lying, then didn't. "Yes." "Good." Daniel looked over. Robert shrugged. "It means you understand this isn't a transaction." The hallway filled and emptied around them as students passed. Some looked tired, some hopeful. One older man in a veteran's cap nodded to both of them as if hallway benches created temporary fellowship among all who waited. Daniel thought about Ethan Cole, 34. Risk analyst. Engaged once. dead on a road outside Mesa, after trying to raise concerns to Victor Lang directly. Employment status closed. Matter resolved. The language still infuriated him. At 10:15, the classroom door opened and students began to filter out. Rachel Levin emerged last, carrying a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and a stack of marked papers pressed against her chest. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with dark hair pulled loosely back and the kind of face grief often leaves behind, not ruined, but permanently sharpened around the eyes. She saw Robert first, then Daniel. Recognition moved across her expression like a shutter closing. Before either man could speak, she said, "No." She turned immediately toward the stairwell. Daniel stood. "Miss Levin, please." She kept walking. Robert moved too, but Daniel lifted a hand slightly, stopping him. Then he followed at a respectful distance. "Rachel," he said, not loudly. "We're not here for publicity." That made her stop halfway to the stairs. She turned with anger already in place. That's exactly what people say right before they use you for publicity. The hallway had gone quieter. A pair of students glanced over, then kept moving. Daniel stopped several feet away. "You have every reason not to trust me," he said. Rachel let out a short laugh with no humor in it. "That's true." Robert approached more slowly, his voice measured. "We're here because of Ethan Cole." Something changed in her face at the name. Not softness. Impact. Old pain hit fresh. She tightened her hold on the papers in her arms. "You don't get to say his name unless you knew him." "No," Daniel said quietly. "But I think I'm starting to know the kind of men who made sure people stopped saying it." That held her. Not for long. Just enough. Rachel looked from Daniel to Robert and back again. "You should leave." Daniel could feel the moment slipping. In a boardroom, he would have filled that silence quickly. Positioned facts, offered incentives, built pressure. Here, instinct told him to do the opposite. So he spoke plainly. "I think Victor Lang may have used my company the same way he used other people," he said. "We found Phoenix. We found Ethan's name. We know he raised concerns before he died. We know he asked for a meeting with Lang directly." Daniel paused. "We also know somebody wanted us to keep digging." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Somebody?" "We got a message. A flicker. Tiny. Real." Daniel saw it and continued. "We didn't come here to drag Ethan into headlines. We came because if there's truth buried in what happened, I want to understand it before Victor buries someone else under another polished statement." Rachel's jaw worked once. For a second, Daniel thought she might walk away anyway. Then she looked down at the papers in her arms as if remembering where she was, took one slow breath, and said, "Not here." Robert and Daniel stayed silent. Rachel glanced toward the windows at the end of the hall. "There's a courtyard behind the library," she said. 10 minutes. Then she turned and walked away before either of them could answer. Daniel watched her go. Robert let out a breath through his nose. "Well," he said. That wasn't a no. Daniel looked toward the courtyard doors. No, he thought. It wasn't. It was the sound a sealed room makes when the first lock clicks open. The courtyard behind the library was small and unexpectedly peaceful, tucked between two low academic buildings as if someone had carved out a quiet place on purpose. A stone fountain sat in the center, its water moving in a soft, steady loop. There were wrought iron tables beneath shade trees, and the late morning light fell across the brick path in broken pieces. Daniel and Robert arrived first. Neither man sat down immediately. Robert stood with one hand in his pocket, scanning the courtyard with the alert stillness of someone who had spent too many years learning where trouble liked to hide. Daniel moved closer to the fountain and listened to the water for a moment, trying to slow the restless machinery in his head. This was not a negotiation. That fact mattered. No opening position, no leverage point, no polished pitch. Just a woman carrying old grief, and two men asking her to trust them with part of it. Daniel was beginning to understand that those might be the hardest conversations of all. Rachel arrived 7 minutes later. No tote bag now. No stack of papers. Just her phone in one hand and a guarded expression that hadn't softened since the hallway. She chose the table farthest from the fountain and sat with the posture of someone prepared to leave at the first wrong sentence. Robert pulled out a chair for himself but did not sit until she had settled. Daniel sat last. For a moment, nobody spoke. Rachel looked from one man to the other. "You've got 5 minutes," she said. Daniel nodded once. That's fair. She folded her arms. Start with why you're really here. Daniel met her gaze. Because Victor Lang set my company up to absorb catastrophic losses through buried revisions in a development contract. We've since found a pattern in older deals. Phoenix Harbor stood out. Ethan Cole stood out more. Then we got a message telling us to look closer. Rachel's face remained still, but her fingers tightened slightly against her sleeve. You think Ethan was killed? It wasn't phrased as a question. Daniel answered carefully. I think he saw something dangerous. I think he tried to raise it. I think he died before he could finish. Rachel looked at Robert. And you? Robert's voice was calm and spare. I think there are enough coincidences around Phoenix Harbor to justify concern. I also think concern isn't proof. We're here because you may know the difference. Rachel gave a small, bitter nod. At least you're honest. A breeze moved through the courtyard, stirring the branches overhead. Somewhere beyond the library wall, a maintenance cart beeped in reverse. The ordinary sounds of a weekday morning pressed gently around the table, almost indecent beside the subject sitting between them. Rachel looked down at her hands. Ethan was not paranoid, she said at last. That matters. Daniel said nothing. She went on. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't a conspiracy guy. He believed in systems, structure, data. If something was wrong, he documented it. That was who he was. Her mouth tightened. It was one of the things I loved about him, and one of the things that made him impossible to live with when he got locked onto a problem. There it was. The shift from resistance to memory. Daniel recognized it not from romance, but from grief in general. Once a person began describing the dead as themselves again, not as a case file, not as a tragedy, but as a person you listened and stayed out of the way. Rachel looked toward the fountain. We were engaged for 8 months, she said. He was good, thoughtful, quiet in public, funny in private. The kind of man who remembered how you took your coffee and which songs made you leave a room because they reminded you of your mother. Her voice caught very slightly, then steadied. When he got hired onto Phoenix Harbor, he was proud of it. He thought it meant stability, bigger projects, better future. We were talking about buying a house. Daniel felt something twist in his chest. A house. There it was again. That image refusing to stay symbolic. The thing everyone thought they were building. Safety. A future. Somewhere to return to. Rachel leaned back a little, as if distance might help. Then he changed. Robert spoke gently. How? At first, just stress. Long hours. More silence. Then he started saying strange things. She looked at Daniel. Not strange in a crazy way. Strange in a frightened way. Daniel held her eyes. What things? Rachel took a breath. That numbers were moving after approval. That invoices didn't match site realities. That material substitutions were being hidden inside emergency variance requests. That shoreline reinforcement budgets were being routed through consultants nobody could explain. She gave a short, humorless laugh. I teach writing now. Back then I was engaged to an engineer who spent dinner sketching cost trees on napkins because he couldn't understand where millions of dollars were disappearing. Robert nodded slightly. Did he say Victor Lang's name? Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Daniel went still. Rachel saw it and continued. Not at first. At first it was just leadership and finance and the people above him. Then one night he came home after a meeting and said, "It goes higher than I thought." Those were his exact words. Daniel spoke quietly. When was that? About 2 weeks before he died. The fountain water continued its soft, indifferent cycle. Rachel lowered her gaze. He started backing up files after that. Duplicates. Printed copies. Email drafts to himself. He became careful in a way that scared me. She swallowed once. He changed his passwords, stopped taking calls in the apartment. Once he got up at 2 in the morning because he thought someone had followed him home from the site. Robert's expression tightened. Did he report that? He said there was nothing to report. Just a car too close for too long. She looked at him sharply. You have to understand. He hated sounding foolish. So if he told me he was worried, he was already past the point of pretending it was nothing. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Did he ever show you the files? Rachel hesitated. That hesitation was the first true hinge of the conversation. Not grief now. Choice. She knew something. Daniel did not push. Robert, to his credit, didn't either. Rachel looked at both men, measuring them again. "Why should I believe you won't bury this if it gets inconvenient?" she asked finally. "You're still Daniel Whitaker. You still have shareholders and boards and lawyers and 1,000 reasons to protect your own name first." It was a fair question. Maybe the fairest one he'd been asked in years. Daniel answered without dressing it up. "Because I already know what it costs when men like me protect the structure before the truth." He paused. "And because if Victor did this to Ethan, then silence would make me part of it." Rachel searched his face. "You say that now." "Yes," Daniel said. "I do," Robert added, in his dry, unadorned way. "And for what it's worth, I'm expensive partly because I don't help clients bury bodies." That startled a laugh out of her before she could stop it. The sound changed the air, only slightly. "Enough." Rachel looked away for a second, as if annoyed with herself for being human in front of them. Then she opened her phone, tapped twice, and held it face down on the table. "There's a storage unit in Glendale," she said. Neither man moved. Rachel kept going. "Ethan rented it 3 days before he died. He told me it was for backup in case the system failed. I thought he was talking about work systems, servers, documents. I didn't know what he meant until after the funeral." Daniel's pulse kicked once, hard. "Did you go there?" She nodded. "Once, 2 weeks later." Her voice grew quieter. "I was too wrecked before that, too angry, too tired. I found a banker's box, a flash drive, and a notebook. I took the notebook home. I left the rest." Robert's brows rose. "Why?" "Because by then I'd already had 2 men in suits come ask polite questions that didn't feel polite. One from Phoenix Harbor Legal. One who said he was with an insurer. Neither one asked what Ethan had found. They asked whether he'd been under stress." Her eyes sharpened. "You understand the difference?" Daniel did. One line searched for truth. The other prepared a story. "What was in the notebook?" he asked. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. "Enough to make me stop believing he died by accident." The courtyard fell silent around them. Not literally. The fountain still moved. A door opened somewhere behind them. Far off, someone laughed. But at the table, the world narrowed. Daniel understood, with the cold clarity that sometimes comes right before the ground gives way, that they had just stepped across another line. This was no longer suspicion. Now it was evidence waiting to be touched. Rachel did not hand them the notebook in the courtyard. Daniel understood why before she said a word. "I didn't bring it with me," she said, her hand still resting on her phone. "I'm not careless, Mr. Whitaker." "Daniel," he said automatically. She gave him a look that made it clear names were not the point. "I kept it because it was the only thing that felt like Ethan still had a voice," she said. "Not because I trust men with expensive watches and legal teams." Robert nodded once, unoffended. "That's sensible." Rachel stood, and for a second Daniel thought she was ending the conversation. Instead, she looked down at both men and said, "If I show you what he wrote, and if I tell you where the storage unit is, this stops being a theory. Do you understand that?" Daniel rose too. "Yes. It also stops being safe." "I know." Her expression sharpened. "No, I don't think you do. Unsafe is not a press conference. Unsafe is not a bad quarter. Unsafe is not watching investors question your judgment on television. Unsafe is realizing a man you loved died, scared, and that people with polished shoes spent the next month trying to make his fear sound like instability." Daniel took that in without flinching. She was right. There were different kinds of danger in the world, and men like him had the luxury of confusing them. Rachel looked at Robert next. "And if this turns into strategy instead of truth, I walk. If Ethan becomes leverage, I disappear." Robert's reply came quiet and immediate. "That won't happen." It was the tone, Daniel thought, more than the words. No flourish. No lawyer's silk. Just an old man making a promise in a plain voice. Rachel studied him, then gave the smallest nod. "My apartment is 15 minutes from here," she said. "You come separately. No assistants, no staff. No one follows." Daniel almost said he understood the risk of that, then stopped himself. She did not need reassurance from him. She needed obedience. "All right," he said. She left first. Daniel watched her cross the courtyard, shoulders set, pace steady. She looked like someone who had been carrying a sealed room inside her for years and had just opened the door half an inch. Robert exhaled beside him. "Well," he said. That was cheerful. Daniel looked at him. "You heard her." "I did. And?" Robert slipped his glasses back on. "And I think she's been waiting a very long time for someone to ask the right question." They parted in the parking lot and drove separately, as instructed. Rachel's apartment was in a low-rise building on a shaded street north of Wilshire, the kind of place built in the 70s and maintained just well enough to remain respectable. Modest landscaping, narrow balconies, a lobby that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old mail. Daniel parked around the corner and waited 2 full minutes before going inside. The apartment itself was small and carefully kept. Bookshelves lined one wall of the living room, crowded with novels, poetry collections, binders, and a few framed photographs. There was no luxury in the place, but there was order, intention. A blue ceramic bowl sat on the coffee table filled with loose keys and folded receipts. A knitted throw rested over the arm of the couch, the sort of home people built not to impress strangers, but to survive themselves. Rachel let them in and did not offer coffee. That too felt fair. "Sit," she said. Daniel and Robert took the couch. Rachel remained standing for a moment, then disappeared down a short hallway. When she returned, she carried a black cloth-bound notebook in both hands. It was worn at the edges, bent slightly at one corner. The object of years of fear. She did not hand it over right away. "He started writing in it when he got convinced his email wasn't safe," she said. "Not because he was dramatic. Because he said paper couldn't be hacked." Robert gave a grim little nod. "Smart." Rachel passed the notebook to Daniel. He took it carefully, almost the way one might accept a personal belonging from a funeral table. Inside, Ethan Cole's handwriting was neat, technical, compressed. The early pages were mostly site notes, materials, change orders, percentages, dates. Then, slowly, the tone changed. The entries sharpened, grew suspicious, became less about engineering and more about human behavior. Daniel read in silence. Substitutions hidden under marine delay coding. Emergency budget transfers routed through consultancy cluster, no technical basis. Spoke to Avery, visibly frightened, said, "Don't put questions in writing." Meeting moved again. No minutes. Same names keep surfacing. Same signatures. Same approvals after objections. On the next page, the handwriting pressed harder into the paper. This is not sloppiness. It's structure. Daniel felt the line all the way down his spine. He turned another page. If anything happens, start with shoreline variance funds. Then compare invoice batches to actual pour schedules. Somebody is washing numbers through delay language. Robert leaned in slightly but did not interrupt. Daniel kept reading. Met with V. L. Assistant meeting request acknowledged but not scheduled. Someone is trying to feel out what I know. Then, lower on the page, written more hastily, Rachel says, "I'm not sleeping." She's right. Keep copies off-site. Daniel stopped there, not because he'd reached the end, because he suddenly needed a second to absorb the fact of Ethan as a living man again. A man who loved someone named Rachel enough to record what she noticed. A man tired enough to admit fear in writing. A man trying, in his own quiet way, to leave a trail in case he didn't get to finish. Daniel closed the notebook halfway and looked up. "This is enough to reopen everything," he said. Rachel's face didn't change. "It was enough to terrify me." Robert held out a hand. Daniel passed him the notebook. Robert read quickly, eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "God," he murmured. Rachel crossed her arms. "There's more." She walked to a drawer beside the bookshelves, took out a key attached to a faded plastic tag, and placed it on the coffee table. Storage Unit B-19, Glendale. He rented it under his middle initial, not his first name. "I checked once after the funeral. I found a banker's box, a flash drive, and rolled site plans in a tube. I put the notebook in my purse and left the rest because I was afraid someone would see me." She paused. "I never went back." Daniel stared at the key. It looked absurdly ordinary. So many lives, he thought, turned on small, ordinary things. A key, a notebook. A clause moved in an appendix. A child asking to sit beside a stranger. Robert closed the notebook gently. "If what's in that unit matches this," he said, "Victor's problem gets much bigger than civil exposure." Rachel looked at him sharply. Don't say his name like this is a chess match. Robert met her gaze. I'm not. I'm saying if Ethan left corroboration, then we stop talking about suspicion and start talking about criminal conduct. That landed. Rachel looked away first. Daniel spoke carefully. Why didn't you come forward before? It was a dangerous question. But not, he thought, an unfair one. Rachel gave a tired, almost incredulous laugh. Come forward to whom? Daniel said nothing. She continued, voice low but steady. To the company lawyers who asked whether Ethan had been emotionally unstable? To the police, who treated his death like a traffic statistic? To reporters who would have called me a grieving fiancé with no proof and moved on by Wednesday? Her eyes found his. Or maybe to a man like you, back then. Rich enough to protect the structure. Busy enough to believe the structure deserved protecting. Daniel took that without defense. Because she was not wrong. Maybe he wouldn't have listened then. Maybe that was the ugliest part of this. He rose and moved to the window, looking down at a narrow strip of courtyard below where an older couple were walking a small white dog. One held the leash. The other carried a grocery bag. Domestic, ordinary life. The kind people thought they were earning when they worked hard and followed rules. Ethan Cole should have had that chance. Rachel's voice came behind him, quieter now. I almost threw the notebook away once. Daniel turned. She sat on the armchair by the bookshelf now, no longer rigid, just tired. I took it out, put it in the kitchen trash, and then spent 10 minutes crying over a garbage can, because it felt like throwing him away. She swallowed, so I kept it. I told myself it was grief. But I think part of me knew the truth was still in there, waiting for someone strong enough or angry enough to carry it. Robert stood, then let us carry it now. Rachel looked at him for a long second. Then she looked at Daniel. Don't fail him, she said. Daniel glanced at the notebook, the key, the room, the entire fragile architecture of trust he had just been handed. His answer came without performance. I won't. Outside, somewhere beyond the apartment walls, a siren passed and faded. Inside, the air remained still. On the coffee table between them, the storage key lay in the afternoon light like the next door waiting to be opened. The storage facility in Glendale sat behind a chain-link gate and a row of sun-faded cypress trees, the kind of place people used when life outgrew its current shape, but they weren't ready to throw anything away. Daniel arrived just before 6 the next morning. Robert was already there, coffee in hand, standing beside the roll-up office window where a board manager in a Dodgers cap was checking IDs and pretending not to notice that one of his early customers was worth more than the entire block. Rachel came last. She parked 2 spaces away and got out without a word, her face pale with lack of sleep but steady. She carried nothing except her purse. Daniel noticed her hands were empty and somehow understood that was deliberate. She had already carried Ethan's voice long enough. Inside, the manager walked them down a narrow concrete corridor that smelled faintly of dust, metal, and old cardboard. Unit B-19 sat at the far end. Rachel took the key from her purse. For a second she just held it there, between her fingers, looking at the lock. Daniel did not speak. Neither did Robert. At last Rachel stepped forward and inserted the key. The lock gave with a dull click. The roll-up door shuddered open. The unit was small, mostly empty. A single banker's box sat against the back wall beside a blueprint tube and a plastic storage bin with no label. Dust lay across the concrete floor, untouched except for the faint marks of Rachel's one visit years ago. Robert exhaled slowly. Well, he said quietly. He was organized. Rachel looked like she might be sick. Daniel stepped into the unit first and crouched by the box. Inside were neatly labeled folders, a flash drive in a small padded envelope, and printed spreadsheets highlighted in yellow and red. The top folder read Shoreline Variance Funds. His pulse kicked once, hard. Robert took the tube and removed the plans. Engineering drawings, hand-marked annotations, dates, cost notes in Ethan's sharp handwriting. Rachel stayed near the door, arms folded tightly across herself. Daniel looked up. You don't have to come closer. I know. But after a moment, she did anyway. Robert opened one of the folders and went very still. Daniel. He turned the page so both could see. It was a transfer schedule. One series of numbers routed through a consulting intermediary. Then another. Layered, repeated, disguised inside delay and reinforcement codes exactly the way Ethan had described in the notebook. Below the final batch was a printed approval chain. Victor Lang's name was on it. No ambiguity now. No elegant distance. No plausible deniability. Rachel pressed one hand to her mouth. Daniel felt the room narrow around him. For 2 full days, he had been operating on suspicion sharpened by pattern. But this was different. This was the moment a shadow became a man. Robert's legal mind moved first. We photograph everything before it leaves the unit. Then we take possession, preserve chain of custody, and send copies to federal counsel before Lang can get wind of this. He looked at Daniel. This cannot go through normal channels now. Daniel nodded once. Do it. Rachel found her voice. So that's it? She asked, her eyes on Victor's printed name. He signed it and kept walking? Robert's answer was quiet. For a long time, yes. Daniel looked at her. Not anymore. By 9 o'clock, 3 different processes were in motion. Whitaker Ventures' outside forensic team had secured digital copies of Ethan's files. Robert had contacted federal investigators through a channel he trusted. And Daniel, after 1 hour of argument from his communications team and 0 patience for any of it, had made a decision that terrified every advisor around him. He was going public, not recklessly, not emotionally, not as a wounded billionaire trying to save his image. As a witness to a pattern, at 11:30, cameras gathered in the Whitaker Ventures lobby. Reporters filled the press room shoulder to shoulder. The story had already mutated overnight. First failed deal, then contract irregularities, now whispers of prior project misconduct. Victor Lang's people had tried to dismiss it as noise. Too late. Daniel stood behind the podium in a dark suit and plain navy tie, one hand resting lightly on the edge. Robert stood off to the side. Linda Marquez sat in the front row with a face like carved granite. Rachel had refused the stage but agreed to remain in the room. Daniel looked out at the cameras and thought, absurdly and vividly, of Annie on the beach. Tell the truth, calm. So he did. Good morning, he said. 2 days ago, this story was framed as a failed business deal. It is no longer that simple. The room went still. Daniel continued without hurry. Since identifying irregularities in the final revisions of our redevelopment contract, my team has uncovered evidence indicating a broader pattern of concealed financial manipulation connected to prior Lang capital projects. This morning, that evidence was provided to the appropriate authorities. Questions exploded before he finished the sentence. He lifted one hand, and the room quieted just enough. I'm going to say something that matters more than market fallout, he said. A man named Ethan Cole raised concerns years ago on one of those projects. He documented what he saw. He tried to be heard. He died before that happened. No one moved. Not even the cameras seemed to breathe. Daniel looked straight into them. For too long, people with power have relied on complexity to hide wrongdoing and on silence to protect the structure around it. That ends now. He did not name murder. He did not overstate what the evidence had not yet legally proved, but he named the corruption, the concealment, the pattern, and the human cost. When questions came again, he answered calmly. Yes, Victor Lang's name appeared in the approvals. Yes, the files had been preserved. Yes, federal authorities had been notified. No, this was not about salvaging his reputation. Then one reporter, older than the rest, stood and asked, Mr. Whitaker, why come forward now? Daniel paused. Because a child reminded me what honesty sounds like, he thought. What he said was, because delay is one of the ways injustice survives. By sunset, Victor Lang was no longer holding press conferences. Federal investigators had executed document preservation orders. Lang Capital's stock was in free fall. 2 former project consultants had already requested legal representation. Anonymous sources who had once whispered to reporters were now calling them back with names attached, and Ethan Cole's name was no longer buried in local archives. It was everywhere. Late that afternoon, when the legal calls slowed and the cameras moved on to their next frenzy, Daniel drove back to Santa Monica. The beach was quieter than the first evening. The light was warmer. The tide was lower. He found Annie exactly where he hoped he might, near the dry sand, crouched over another construction project with her red bucket beside her. Marianne sat on a blanket a short distance away with a paperback in her lap, looking up as Daniel approached. Annie spotted him first. Daniel. She sprang to her feet and waved both arms as if he were an old family friend and not a man who had spent the day dismantling a financier on live television. Daniel smiled, really smiled, and walked toward her. "What are you building this time?" he asked. "A better one," Annie said. He looked down. A fresh shell house stood in the sand, wider and stronger than the first, with thicker walls and a shell-lined path leading straight to the water. Annie placed one final shell at the doorway, then sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "Did you fix your problem?" Daniel glanced toward Marianne. She was watching quietly, understanding more than Annie could yet know. He looked back at the little house. "Not all of it," he said. "But I fixed the part that needed truth." Annie seemed to consider that carefully. Then she nodded. "That's the most important part." Daniel lowered himself into the sand beside her, expensive trousers and all. He helped her press another shell into the wall. Annie grinned. "See?" she said. "It stays up better when more than one person builds it." Daniel looked out at the ocean, then back at the small house facing it. For the first time in a very long while, the future did not feel like a fortress he had to defend alone. It felt like something gentler, something truer, something built, shell by shell, by the people brave enough to sit beside what hurts and tell the truth anyway. The tide would come. It always did. But this time, Daniel thought, watching the little house glow in the late light, he finally knew the difference between losing something and rebuilding it right. The story reminds us that kindness, truth, and courage often begin with the smallest actions. A simple moment, a child offering comfort to a stranger, can change the direction of someone's life. Annie's innocence reminded Daniel that real strength is not found in wealth or power, but in choosing honesty when it is difficult and standing up for those who no longer have a voice. The story also shows that injustice can hide behind complex systems and powerful people, but it cannot survive forever when someone decides to tell the truth. In the end, the message is simple yet powerful. One act of compassion can awaken courage, and when people stand together for what is right, even the strongest walls of corruption can fall. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.